Yaki Marie. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Rinnai, New Zealand. I'm Alice Wu, National Specification Manager from Rinnai, your host and moderator. Thank you for taking the time to join us today as we talk about the future of LPG in New Zealand. While we're waiting for everyone to arrive, let's test the chat function by typing our answers to this question. What's your go-to barbecue meal? Pop your answers in the chat. Now, don't be shy. We want to know all your favorites. Can anyone see us?
Steak.
See. Oh, barbecue skewers. That's great. Excellent. Oh, we've got lots of classics, steaks. Anyone for sausages? Roast lamb. Yes. Prawn skewers. Excellent. One bonus point if your barbecue is by LPG, powered by LPG. Chicken wings, kebabs. Excellent. Anyone for grilled pineapples? That's the next level up. Love to see the variety here, and clearly we've got some serious barbecue talent in the room. Thanks, everyone. Good to know chat is working and some great barbecue favorites coming through. Sounds like LPG is powering a lot of delicious meals out there. Now, for those of you that just joined us, I'm Alice, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar on the future of LPG in New Zealand. It's great to have you all here, whether you're joining us from the architectural, gas fitting, engineering, building, or merchant side. We really appreciate you taking the time. Today, we're diving into some important topics that are shaping the future of energy in our homes and businesses. We'll be looking at LPG compared to natural gas, where availability is heading, including renewable options, and how LPG can continue to be a reliable alternative for cooking, heating, and hot water. It's our pleasure to welcome two industry experts to the session today, Jeffrey Clark from Gas NZ and Chris Dolman from Lind Group. Today's format will be 50 minutes of presentation followed by Q&A. For smooth running of the presentation, we kindly ask you to submit your questions in the Q&A section and we'll answer them during Q&A time. So grab your lunch and let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, Jeffrey Clark. Jeffrey is the Chief Executive of Gas NZ, the industry voice of gas, with a vision of a sustainable net zero emissions New Zealand, where Kiwi households and businesses can enjoy gas as a reliable, affordable energy source. Jeffrey was formerly Chief Executive of the New Zealand Wine Industries Research and Innovation Centre, Brigata Research Institute, and was previously General Manager, Advocacy and General Counsel for New Zealand Wine Growers, the New Zealand wine industry's peak body. He brings energy experience from earlier career roles in the sector, including as Legal Affairs Manager at Meridian and 4 years as New Zealand's Energy Advisor at the International Energy Agency in Paris, working to protect New Zealand's long-term energy interests. He also worked for Frank as a Mergers and Acquisitions Counsel in New York and London, and as a corporate lawyer for Russell McVeigh in New Zealand. Over to you, Jeffrey.
Thanks very much, Alice. I think I need to shorten that bio down. It's a little bit long. Thanks very much for inviting us along here today, and great to see so many people interested in hearing a bit more about LPG. So I'm going to start off talking about the state of natural gas in New Zealand, because that's kind of the scarcity dynamic that we're in at the moment. Then move on to talking about the existing LPG supply chain, and the way that LPG is there available as a reliable source of energy. I'll then hand over to Chris, who's going to talk about using LPG as an alternative to natural gas and the process that is involved in changing appliances over, what's involved, how much does it cost, and so on. I think before we kind of start, it's important to understand that natural gas and LPG distinction, and it's something that's quite often missed. And in fact, probably go so far as saying it's usually missed in the discussion about gas and the state of play in gas in New Zealand. We do hear a lot about a gas shortage in New Zealand. The really important thing to keep in mind is that is only natural gas that's short at the moment. That's the natural gas that's been coming from our offshore fields, and that is quite separate from LPG. So natural gas is methane. LPG is propane or a mixture of propane and butane. Now, we've sourced a lot of our LPG gas in New Zealand from those fields, but we also have always imported some, and we're importing increasing amounts at the moment. So natural gas and LPG are different gases, but essentially they have the same application, the same range of uses, pretty much the same energy value. For New Zealand, natural gas is always delivered in a network pipeline. That's in the North Island only. If you're talking about gas in the South Island, you're talking about LPG. If you're talking about gas that's being delivered in cylinders or tanks, that's LPG, highly compressed, comes in cylinders. Sometimes it's also reticulated, so into pipelines. So in the South Island, we have Christchurch, Dunedin, Wanaka, and Queenstown have smallish reticulated LPG networks. So hopefully that's clarified a little bit on that distinction about what is LPG and what is natural gas. When people are talking about the scarcity really is only talking about natural gas. And that's a mistake that gets made fairly often. The New Zealand Green Building Council recently put out a report on electrification, and it had some really good content, but it did conflate natural gas and LPG and made the mistake of saying they're both scarce and running out. And so that kind of affected their analysis in that document. So looking at the natural gas markets in New Zealand, yes, it has been reducing availability. The natural gas supply has been declining, and the fields are getting older and approaching the end of their lives. And as they get older, there's more and more chance that when you dig a well in there, you're going to come up with either a small amount or nothing at all. As a result of that, the amount of natural gas that we have available for the future is being revised down. And that means that natural gas contracts are either not being renewed, or they're being renewed at much higher prices, or they're being renewed with capacity limits or shortage pricing. So it's becoming tighter out there for natural gas contracts. I should point out that there probably still is a very significant amount of natural gas out there that hasn't been discovered, but the investments are not being made to find that new gas. One thing that you probably will have heard about is that LNG, liquefied natural gas, is being explored as a potential option. So that's the same gas, but compressed and shipped around the world in ships. If it were to happen, it would likely be some time away. There would be consenting issues, infrastructure issues that need to be developed, and likely there would be consenting problems, and the cost of bringing LNG into New Zealand would affect the market. So it is still an option, and there are a range of different ways it could come to be, but none of them are ideal. They would all be some pros and cons about how it was delivered. So I'm not expecting that we will see LNG imports here anytime soon, but it may well be that something along that line goes ahead. There is some expansion of the existing wells, particularly the onshore wells, that's going on, but I think new exploration for new major finds is unlikely in the near term. On the other hand, biogas, biomethane, is here. There is now the biogas plant at Reparoa near Auckland, converting Auckland's food scrap waste and other organic waste into biomethane, which is the same gas as natural gas. It's being injected into the natural gas pipeline. So it's here today. It's not here in any volume, and we are working with the government to expand the amount of that that's available. But on the other hand, LPG is here now, and it is a very credible alternative for many natural gas customers, and it is not running out. So you could think of LPG as a secure fuel with an existing infrastructure. At the moment, our New Zealand households and businesses use around 200,000 tonnes of LPG annually. That's about the same size as 2/3 of the domestic and commercial natural gas market. So we use about 10 petajoules of energy in LPG and about 15 for domestic and small commercial natural gas users. So that gives you a sense of its scale. There's around 300,000 households on LPG, mostly the 45 kilogram bottles that often come in twin packs at your house. And that's about the same number of households that use natural gas. So despite that declining local production that was connected to the natural gas fields offshore, LPG supply is not constrained at all. And we've always imported LPG into the South Island. It comes into Littleton and Dunedin. And we've long imported some into the North Island as well. Most of it comes from Australia, and we have spare import capacity that we're not using. With some additional investment in the North Island's import capacity can be fairly significantly increased, and we're not exactly sure what that number is, but a fairly significant additional import in our LPG capacity at Port Taranaki and an Auckland LPG terminal that's currently closed because it wasn't required. In terms of the global supply, LPG is widely traded. There's about 300 million tons of LPG being shipped around the world. We use about 0.5% of that, so there's absolutely no supply constraint for New Zealand getting more and more gas. So I guess the summary takeout from all of that is, number one, LPG and natural gas are different, but they have essentially the same function. There is a shortage of natural gas, but there is absolutely no shortage of LPG, and there is plenty of future availability. So we need to think of LPG as a reliable, secure, available fuel at the moment, and we have import terminals that provide additional resistance if we wanted to expand the use within the New Zealand energy market. Chris, over to you.
Hey, Jeff, give me one more minute. I'm just getting out of the cab. As you know, I got stuck in Auckland-style traffic in Melbourne. So if you can keep going, I just need to find somewhere to put my stuff. I'll be 2 seconds.
Okay, that's fine.
Let me do the bio for Chris. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. So let me just grab Chris's. Right, so to introduce our second speaker for today, he's joining us from Australia, Melbourne. Stuck in traffic. So Chris is the head of marketing for Lind South Pacific, covering the L-Gas and BOC businesses. Chris has worked for Lind Group since 2004, both in South Pacific and in the UK, and has held a number of roles across product and marketing management, business development, acquisitions, sales and health and safety. During this time, he has extensive experience in the applications of gas across many sectors, including universities and research, domestic and clean energy for industrial users. Chris has extensive experience in energy vectors, including LPG, LNG, and hydrogen, as well as decarbonisation pathways, including renewable LPG molecules. Chris says, safe, reliable, and cost-effective energy is critical to everyone from home to industrial users. Chris, sorry to hear that you were stuck in Melbourne traffic, and thank you very much for joining us from the cab today. Are you able to talk to us now? You are
not.
Yes.
Okay, I am here. So I'm just we just took a wrong spot, but that's all right. We're pretty much done. So thank you for your understanding. I try not to be as all over the place, but today I'm sort of taking you through. I'm going to take you through the different options you've got for LPG as a replacement for LNG and the different things you can do moving forward. So I've got a number of slides which talk about the different applications. Thanks, mate. Have a good day. Oh, sorry, one more second, then I'm done. So basically talking through the different applications and how you can achieve what you need in terms of energy reliability and security using, you know, products such as LPG as an equivalent or as a sort of replacement for the LPG you're currently using. So hopefully there's not too much wind around me. I'm actually in a car park at the moment, but that's okay. there are a number of different options you have depending on your use case and depending on the criticality of your supply. So if you look at what you can do moving forwards, you can look at things like dual connections. So that allows you to use either an LPG or a natural gas burner. That gives you really good flexibility, particularly if you're an industrial user and you have peaky demand. So it allows you to manage things like pipeline costs and all that sort of stuff. So that's really suitable for industrial and commercial. Today you can actually replace your burner to LPG straight away, and you can get a longer term deal for LPG. So that is an alternative as well. That's suitable and relatively simple. I think many of us have bought a barbecue, for example, that's either LPG or natural gas and converted it over. And that can be quite a cost effective thing to do, and basically a couple of $100. The last option, and we do see a little bit of this in New Zealand and Australia, is synthetic natural gas. So effectively you can mix LPG with air and use all your existing infrastructure. So it means you can use your existing pipelines, existing appliances, and make no changes. It's not really suitable for an individual residential place at this stage because of cost. It's unlikely to be, but it is suitable for residential networks and also for industrial type users as a potential way forward. So a little bit more on dual fuel burners for flexibility. Effectively, what you can do is introduce a second burner into your system within your existing boiler or other appliance, and it effectively means that you can have a cylinder of LPG on site or a tank, depending on the size and what you're doing, and you can actually use it to sort of peak shave where you've got deficiencies of natural gas, or you can't get access to that gas. So that's something that we think is a really suitable piece for particularly a larger industrial user who can't get that long-term gas contract or can't get that long-term gas and pipeline contract at an appropriate price. It also gives you a bit of pricing flexibility and the ability to have options, which is always important when you're procuring energy. If we look at a burner replacement, that's a really simple thing to do for houses, and we're seeing that today as people get concerned about either availability of natural gas or the fact that as people jump off the network, pipeline prices are likely to increase. As Jeffrey said earlier, you can get LPG pretty much everywhere in New Zealand and internationally. New Zealand's got a really good setup in terms of imports, as well as a number of suppliers out there who can supply pretty much everywhere throughout the islands. So this is something that I think is really suitable for houses now, but it also is suitable for some of those I&C customers who are struggling to get the gas they need to sort of be viable moving forwards. Then we move on to synthetic natural gas. So synthetic natural gas is a really good option if you're a bigger user and you don't want to change any of your boilers or change any of your burners over. It's also a really interesting thing that we've seen at a number of larger residential networks. There's a bit to make it happen, but if you do have a network already or you're about to build something, that's the opportunity. You can actually build that embedded network into the new area, and then you can effectively supply natural gas or synthetic natural gas to them under a long-term deal. So I think that's a really interesting alternative for newer applications, but also for some of those other applications where they're struggling to get natural gas over time. It's probably not suitable for a single resident. You're better off looking at LPG or other alternatives, but it's something that can be considered if you're effectively creating a new housing development or something of that nature. Here's some pictures of LPG just to show it's real, I suppose. We've got a range of infrastructure across the islands. Basically it could be cylinders. So lots of people have cylinders. We have banks of cylinders for smaller networks. We do some SNG in the South Pacific, but there are different options. And I think the flexibility of LPG and the ability to get it anywhere in a cylinder gives you really good options as an alternative as we move through this energy transition to greener fuels over time as well that Jeffrey referred to, whether that's be it bio LPG or something else. So renewable LPG is something that we've talked about as a sector for a long time. At the moment, we've also talked about other chemical substitutes like dimethyl ether. In reality, the most likely renewable LPG to hit the market in our regions is going to be as a SAF byproduct. So SAF is sustainable aviation fuel. One of the sort of byproducts of SAF is actually renewable LPG. The renewable SAF producers can either use that in their process, or they could sell it to people like Elgas and others, and we could supply that as a renewable product. That product is likely to come from vegetable products, meat products, all that sort of stuff. So it's seen as a renewable product. We expect to see that in the market in at least small quantities from 2028. But we also expect that to increase over time as a lot of countries bring in sustainable aviation mandates, particularly Europe, which is leading the way, and some parts of the US. So we see this as a real pathway moving forwards, and we see it's coming. And, you know, it's one that we're talking to a range of SAF providers ourselves across Australia, New Zealand, and, you know, into China as to whether we can access this product moving forwards. We still don't have costs, if anyone's going to ask those sort of pieces, but, you know, we know it needs to be cost effective for home and industrial users if it's going to stay in the energy mix. So, you know, in summary, LPG is a viable option. It's safe, effective, and reliable throughout New Zealand. You know, what does it cost? Well, it really depends on how much you take and where you are. But there are supply chains that are moving LPG from in tanks to smaller cylinders across the island. So there are plenty of options. If you are going to move to LPG from natural gas and you're a larger user, obviously you would likely need a tank, and we would top fill that, or others would top fill that. And, you know, that's really going to depend on drop size and a number of pieces, but we see it as a option. And there are a lot of industrial users and mines across Australia and New Zealand who are currently already using LPG. In terms of conversion fees, it really depends on your appliance. You know, if it's a barbecue, for example, that could be a couple of $100 in parts plus labor. If you're talking about a, you know, industrial boiler, that's going to be more complicated, but, you know, working with the OEMs such as Rinnai and others allows you to work out what that cost would be if that's an option you want to look at. That is me from a garage, apologies, but hopefully that's been a useful sort of view in terms of what the actual market looks like at the moment. And I think now we were going to open it up to Q&A.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for that very insightful presentation, Chris. And so before we jump into Q&A, I've dropped the survey link in the chat, which only takes 1 minute to complete. If you've got specific questions for us, please leave your name and details in the survey feedback so we can get back to you. Let's start with some questions we received before the webinar. Probably one for you, Jeffrey. We keep hearing that gas is running out. Is that true for LPG?
I guess I touched on that before, and I think the short answer is no. Here in New Zealand, our LPG has historically come from the natural gas fields, but we have also imported it as well. If the natural gas production continues to decline, then that source of LPG will decline. But importantly, we have really good import capacity for LPG, and we always have been importing LPG, and we still will be. So there's a very large global supply, and it's readily available. In fact, we get most of ours from Australia, and Australia quite scarily stores a lot of theirs underneath their airport. So it's readily available to us.
Good. Next one. Well, the price
Jeffrey,
of LPG...
to your question, it is a strange supply chain, LPG. It does move from, we pull it in from everywhere from Australia to Saudi to the US. So there are lots and lots of different options.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Next one, will the price of LPG keep going up as a link to the natural gas price?
Let me just polish out my crystal ball here. Again, I think it's important to know that the natural gas price and the LPG price in New Zealand are not necessarily connected. I mean, you've got to factor in the market dynamics, but globally, the LPG price, as Chris said, tends to be based on the Saudi price. There's like a global benchmark price, and our New Zealand price tends to reflect that movement in price, so it doesn't reflect the scarcity situation that we're experiencing with natural gas. So although there have been some pretty wild swings in the pricing of industrial natural gas here in New Zealand, that hasn't really happened for LPG, and those prices tend to be separate. So yeah, not connected.
It's if you can look at the Saudi CP piece. It's a publicly available piece. Effectively, what happens pretty much every year is that when it's cold in the northern hemisphere, the price goes up, and when it's not cold in the northern hemisphere, it comes down. So there is a key seasonality piece, which is probably to New Zealand and Australia's advantage because we're cold at the different times of the year.
Yeah.
Is there a way for us to produce LPG in New Zealand?
Well, yes, we have been producing LPG in New Zealand, and I guess once we start talking about renewable LPG, then yes, there are ways to do that too. I think as Chris said, the most obvious renewable LPG form would be as a byproduct of producing sustainable aviation fuel. Realistically, given the economies of scale, I think that's more likely to come out of Australia, and Australia is kind of much larger sourcing of it, but it's certainly being looked at here. But again, I guess I would just make the point, there is no shortage of LPG, and there is not predicted to be a shortage of LPG. Now, that's kind of completely aside from the emissions questions.
Next one, our experience is that actual costs to homeowners of converting from gas to electricity ends up much higher than they expect. So why is the information not out there?
That's a good question, and that is something that we do hear quite frequently. Homeowners who think, I'd like to convert off gas to electricity, fine, and indeed I found this when I was doing kitchen renovations. Things will come along like when you're upgrading your electrical circuit, you actually have to replace your switchboard, and then in my case I had to rewire the rest of my downstairs because they wouldn't touch the switchboard without rewiring the rest of the downstairs. So it ended up costing me a lot more than I expected. And we do also hear that if people are thinking, for example, of putting in a hot water heat pump instead of a gas hot water heater, then they've got plumbing that has to be reorganized, and power circuits have to be reorganized as well because they tend to be much larger power circuits. So I think some of those costs, the headline figures that get touted around for, the costs of a heat pump and how much more efficient they are, well, that's true. If you look at those in isolation, they are relatively small costs and there's funding available for them, but you actually need to step back and look at the entire cost of making the change. Another thing which I think also hasn't been spoken about, but is increasingly going to be a factor, is the system cost of shifting from gas to electricity. And I know the gas industry company and ECA are doing some analysis of this at the moment. So I think there's a report due out before the end of the year. Because if you think about when demand happens, we know there's a morning and an evening peak for electricity, and that's where in winter those systems are pretty much at capacity. There's a pretty small limit how much gas we can shift off at peak time and add on to the electricity peaks without requiring new lines builds and transmission builds and generation builds for electricity. So the costing of that has not really been modeled because people haven't really thought about that. So I think there'll be some interesting debate about that over coming months. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That's great. What are your thoughts about Methanex factory in Taranaki that uses half the country's natural gas supply?
That's for you, Jeffrey.
Yeah, okay. So that's really interesting. if you wind the clock back, the only reason we really have natural gas in New Zealand is because the Methanex plant was built at the same time as the Maui fields were developed. So the two come together. But now if you look at, we're obviously short of natural gas now, and the Methanex plant last year used about 14 times more natural gas than all residential users combined. So if Methanex were to shut down for a year, there would effectively be 14 more years of residential natural gas available. But obviously, as with all these things, it is much more complex than that, because they are a major part of the system. They don't actually provide cover a lot of the cost of the network, because they're right there where the pipeline comes in out of the sea. But there are all sorts of complicated dynamics about how the gas fields themselves operate and what minimum demand they need and so on. So I think it's fair to say that Methanex is probably going within the next couple of years as their current contract winds down, and they have to decide whether they will reinvest in their periodic upgrades of their plants. I think most people think they'll probably go. Will that mean there's a whole bunch more natural gas that comes onto the market, or maybe less than a whole bunch more, but quite a lot? I'm afraid we're just going to have to wait and see. I think they will go, and I think it will result in changes to the market, probably with more gas available.
Thank you.
I think, so Jeffrey, to that sort of point, we've seen similar big industrial users leave Australia for similar reasons. And it does a couple of, well, it reduces emissions. So I suppose that is the only one positive, but it has a huge impact on jobs in different regions. And it also does impact the whole energy system, which, whether we understand it or not, the whole LPG to natural gas to electricity, it's all a related network in many ways, doing different things. So, as things change, particularly material things, we just need to sort of make sure it's a planned transition. Otherwise, to your point, you don't have transmission lines, you don't have all those sort of things. Yeah.
And I think that is a really good point. We do not have an energy strategy in New Zealand, and that is sorely missing. We do not have an agreement either from the government or from the government and the opposition and industry to say, here's how we see the transition working. We know that natural gas supply is running out. We know we need to increase our renewable electricity generation. But what about renewable gas? How are we incentivizing that? What about other options? How are we going to integrate all the renewable electricity generation in with the rest of our system? And what's the cost of that going to be? And who do we expect will pay that cost? Those are all questions that an energy strategy ought to put up for debate, and we ought to agree as a country.
Thank you both.
Don't worry, Jeffrey, we're exporting so much gas that we're going to start importing. So Australia is also a total cluster. Sorry, Alice.
Next one is actually for you, Chris. Are there renewable forms of LPG available, and is it all fossil gas?
So at the moment, there are very limited renewable LPG. So there are a number of renewable DME sources, so dimethyl ether. They're typically at 5 to 8 times the current cost of LPG. So they're really not viable for many parties. We have bought some renewable DME in to test it on appliances at sort of up to 15%. But the more the market shifted towards the SAF projects that are coming, that's the pathway I think is the most realistic. I'm not sure DME will play a huge part because you have to change so many parts because of its corrosiveness. We are across some of those DME plants from timber that are planned in Australia, and I think there are opportunities to use timber waste in New Zealand as well for whether it be DME or a renewable LPG. But I think and again, I'll have to borrow Jeffrey's crystal ball to an extent, but I think the value of sustainable aviation fuel is probably going to mean those projects happen first, which means we get what we need as a byproduct.
Yeah, and I think I was just trying to scroll through the Q&A questions there, and then one of them was about how sustainable is LPG. Well, LPG, like natural gas, is a fossil fuel, but there are the renewable gas versions of them. So for natural gas, it's biomethane that comes from processing organic waste. For LPG, it's most likely to come first from the manufacturer of sustainable aviation fuel from a range of different sources. And my understanding, which is quite poor, is that you can tune that process to either generate more SAF or more LPG, depending on what the market needs are. So it's most likely that we will have sustainable versions of LPG, which typically get called renewable liquid gas, because it doesn't have P for petroleum business. And that those will be direct replacements for LPG, but they're probably not here in New Zealand for a little while.
Hey, Jeffrey. So probably on that one, will the LPG gas increase due to demand in New Zealand once natural gas is gone? And where are we at with hydro gas conversion?
I mean, to the first point, probably, but it also depends on other vectors. So, as you see biomethane come more into the system, that'll replace some of it. So you won't need to replace that with bio-LPG or LPG. So I think the answer is likely, but the ultimate answer is because we don't really have a plan in what is an important transition, and in many countries, not just New Zealand, we actually don't know. And there's going to be some unintended consequences of, we've seen that in Victoria of banning natural gas to homes and not having a plan to transition them to anything. So I think that comes down to having a proper policy that's backed with a plan and appropriate funding to support those who are going to be impacted. And that's the only way this transition is going to work for anyone. And I don't know hydro gas. That might be you, Jeff.
I'm not quite sure what hydro gas is.
Is it hydrogen? Because I can talk to
hydrogen. Oh, it could be hydrogen. There you go.
Yeah, so my background, I've done a lot of work in hydrogen. I personally don't see hydrogen to the home. I think it's really unlikely. I think the cost does not make sense versus biomethane versus electrification. So I don't see that. I think there is a role for hydrogen in some of the bigger industrial heat sections, and steel and all that sort of stuff. So I do see that there will be a role for hydrogen, but it's probably, well, technically people used to refer to it as the Swiss Army knife. I'm not sure it is the Swiss Army knife. I think it's probably one of the toolkit that we need to focus on the right application.
And I've heard there's been a reasonable amount of discussion lately that you can think of hydrogen as being a bit like a battery, because if you're generating electricity and you don't have demand, then one thing you can do with it is to convert it into hydrogen and store the hydrogen and then use that. But it's not super efficient way to store the energy, but it does work.
No question. Isn't New Zealand better off to secure our own natural gas supply rather than being reliant on overseas supply, since we have such a small consumer on international market? Jeffrey.
The short answer is probably yes. I mean, you're always better off if you have energy sovereignty and you can support yourself. And but if you look at New Zealand's total energy consumption, a huge portion of it is imported. Most of our liquid fuels, our petrol and our diesel, are imported. So the more we can be independent of that, the better. So that's one of the negative arguments for importing LNG. That's not good. We have produced LPG here in New Zealand, and we still are producing it. But if our import chain is basically to bring it in from Australia, that's a lot more secure than many other import chains. So relatively speaking, our LPG import is essentially from Australia to Taranaki or Dunedin or Littleton. And it's your problem in Australia as to where you get it from. So just stop exporting quite so much.
Well, but to your point, I mean, energy sovereignty and getting the right cost for it is critical to both of our countries, yeah. And that's around having a plan. And Australia's a great example on the East Coast of not having a plan and totally stitching ourselves up. So we won't blame one gas company for that in particular, but anyway, I think it's, again, all of these things need a plan, and if you have a proper plan that's agreed and sort of supported, then I think you don't get into a pickle where you don't have enough energy potentially.
That's all the questions. Thank you very much, both Jeffrey and Chris. Now, to conclude, LPG is reliable, safe, effective, and there's no shortage of supply. And for those worried about natural gas supply, conversion of appliances from natural gas to LPG is simple, effective, and affordable. So thank you all for joining us today. We hope you found the webinar insightful, and we'll share the recording later. Thank you again. See you next time. Mā te wā.
Great. Thanks very much.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.